This video is brought to you by Titan Comic Pressing. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Titan Comic Pressing LLC. Hey all, I'm Patrick and welcome to the first episode of Back Issues. This is a supplementary series on the channel that focuses on comic book collecting. It could be speaking about collecting in general, what is going on in the collecting world, collecting tips, or maybe just some fun stuff that I found or recommendations for things to look into for either collecting or just reading purposes. I thought the best place to start would be on a high-level view of the comic book collecting hobby. Different people have different ideas of what comic book collecting means, so in order to set the tone for the channel, I figured it would be a good idea to just level set what comic book collecting means to me. I've been doing this quite a bit during this, I think, the little bunny rabbit ears for emphasis or terms or whatnot, so I get used to it, I guess. They'll be warned, this is going to get nerdy and not just in a I love comic book kind of way. We're going to get into definitions of things. One of my sayings is, words mean things. It seems like a pretty obvious or simple statement, but it is true. Words have a meaning. It is our foundation for communicating, so we have to respect it. All right. So the logical place to start to define comic book collecting or a comic book collection is to define what a collection is. If we look up this term up on Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the first definition is the act or process of collecting. Seems a bit too self-referencing to be of any use, so good job Merriam and or Webster for that one. Definition 2 states something collected. Again, loads of help, but this has some notes where we will find our answer. An accumulation of objects gathered for study, comparison, or exhibition, or as a hobby. Aside from the questionable grammar of that statement, it is perfect. A collection is any accumulation of a thing, in our case, comic books, and for any of those reasons. And honestly, any of those reasons can be valid for comic book collecting. And nowhere does it say that you have to meet some sort of minimum criteria of what those things are. Or the status or state of those things. I think there are some people out there that will try to invalidate others that don't meet their own perceived level of collecting. There's those ears again, sorry. Like if you don't have expensive or key issues in your collection, you're not a true collector. If you don't read at least X number of issues every week or every month, you're not a true collector. But that is bull. If you read only one series and keep the issues, you have every right to call yourself a comic book collector as much as anyone else. If you have a bunch of issues you obtained when you were younger and you enjoy hanging on to them, but don't buy anything new, you too can call yourself a collector. Comics are objects, and any number greater than 0 is an accumulation. So says Merriam-Webster. So for better or worse, you are a collector. Let's move back a step in the term comic book collection and break down what a comic book is. It seems pretty obvious, but you might be surprised. We can probably all agree that this is a comic, just a normal what you'd probably think as a single issue of a comic book. But what about this? A trade paperback, which is an aggregation of previously individually sold comics. And what about this? A graphic novel, never sold in issue form, but a full story or part of a larger story in its own right. If you collect just any of these last two, are you still a comic collector? So let's once again lean on the dictionary as a source of what a comic book is. Now, this actually leads us down a bit of a rabbit hole that we'll need to follow. A comic book is defined as a magazine containing sequences of comic strips. Okay, I suppose that's hard to argue, but what is a magazine and what is a comic strip? If we dig deeper into that, a magazine is a print periodical containing miscellaneous pieces and often illustrated. Cool. I understand print, and I definitely understand often illustrated. They'll also notice it doesn't make any mention of size or type of binding, meaning all three of these examples would qualify as a magazine. It doesn't mention whether or not it is staple bound or glue bound or hardcover or soft cover. So all three of these, oops, Sandman's backwards. All three of these would technically be considered magazines. So next, comic strip, which is defined as a group of cartoons in narrative sequence. So basically, illustrations, pretty pictures, put together to make a story. And again, with no mention of requirements for words or not, and words certainly having words certainly is not a disqualifier. So again, it seems that all three of these mediums can be considered having comic strips. They are illustrated, a sequence of illustrations or cartoons, panels, that put together in a sequence tell a story or a narrative. Doesn't matter what the binding is for it to be considered a magazine, and doesn't matter what the original source was, whether it is a what we most popularly think of as a comic book, that it originally was printed in individual comic books, or is just a sequence of images that tell a story printed as such on its own. So again, all of these seems to me could be considered comic books. So if you exclusively collect trades or graphic novels, don't let anyone tell you that you're not a legitimate comic collector because you don't get those individual issues. So now what about digital comics? Okay, so if someone only gets comics in digital form, is this still a comic book collection? Well, then we'd have to get into what does it mean for something to be in print, and this may be a little too nitty-gritty. Personally, going back to the definition of collection, to me, an accumulation supposes something physical, which would mean something that you can hold, which a digital comic may not fit the bill for that. But if you're one of those that only reads digital and you call yourself a comic book collector, hey, man or lady, I love that you love it, and I'm not going to fight you on it. Call yourself a comic book collector all day. We have enough in common to talk about without fighting about those sort of details. If you love the medium, if you love the stories, then I love that you love it. Let's get together and talk comics. So that's all I really have for this episode. Next time, I want to talk about different types of comic book collecting and maybe some strategies, see what kind of families that they can fall into, and delve in a little bit into that and see what you fall into. And I think it's important for everyone to kind of determine what type of collector they are. And you don't necessarily just have to fall into one camp. I know that I certainly don't. But it's important to know what your strategies are and what type of collector that you are. So until then, I hope to see you next time.